So the title of this talk is Conscious Worlds, Beautiful Loops in Cells and Silicon. And my name is Ruben. And so consciousness may still be the greatest mystery in science. And part of the reason is that there is yet no good reason for experience. We don't really know why it is that we have this rich inner subjective world that we do. So consciousness remains a pretty big problem in science, and this is our sort of attempt at this very large problem. And in fact, I didn't intend to have a go at this problem. So this was very much a accidental theory of consciousness that emerged as Shamil and I were really working on a computational framework for meditation. But it turns out if you want to understand meditation, you end up looking pretty closely at consciousness. And so as we started to come up with some interesting loops and ideas about meditation, we realized, hey, there might be something worth saying about consciousness itself. And so this is how we ended up here. And the basic thesis is this, and then I'll be unpacking this basic thesis throughout the rest of the talk. So a system that is conscious ought to satisfy three criteria. The first criteria is the generation of a world model. So this is what can be known. The second criteria is inferential competition, which is essentially the selection process for what becomes conscious as opposed to what remains unconscious. And the third is the crucial, I suppose, more novel part of our story, which is this idea of epistemic depth. And this is what allows the world model to actually be known. And together they form a beautiful loop, a world model that knows itself. And so recently, Anil and Tim said that active inference provides theories for consciousness science rather than theories of consciousness per se. And I guess what we're also going to try to argue here is that active inference possibly can satisfy the criteria for a theory of consciousness if we add hypermodeling, which is the ergo a formal version of epistemic depth. And I think this may turn out to be important for self-supervision and general intelligence, at least conceptually. How accurate any of the implementations turn out to be remains to be seen. But I think we need to think about something like this when we're talking about the epistemic flexibility and agency reminiscent of general intelligence. All right, so how to build a self-aware world model. So this is going to be now the criteria in more detail. So criteria one, a world model. This is super central, so I'll spend a little bit of time on this. A world model, in very simple terms, we can think of as a compression of the causes of our sensory data. So we live in this immensely complex and rich world, and in order to make sense of it with limited resources, in order to act adaptively in the present and in the future, we need to make a model of it. And this ends up, of course, always being a compression because you can't fit the whole universe in your brain. So in nature, even materials can be homeostatic in the sense of maintaining their state, but only organisms are allostatic. And so something unique about our world model is that we sprout this counterfactual tree that allows us to not only represent potential causes of our sensory data in the now, but also across time at multiple levels of abstraction and increasing compression. So our world models are quite extraordinary because the brains that we have are structures that beget structures, compressions that beget compressions, things that create things. And it's really like over our evolutionary trajectory, the richness of our computational powers inside of our heads really allow us to build realities far beyond even what might be out there in the present moment. And so ultimately, we become much less passive information receivers and much more generative, creative systems that can proactively prepare for perturbations and future realities. So nature generates generative life, which is very cool. And in fact, we can say that nature computes computers that compute computers, which is very extraordinary. The question then is, of course, how precisely do we create these world models that allow us to survive across time? And for this, I think, and more people, I think, believe that active inference is a promising framework for thinking about how the brain and possibly AI can build world models and to massively oversimplify it. The brain is making predictions, and through the interface of the body, noticing errors through, but also through through actions, and then through a complex hierarchy of processing these what ends up being basically uncertainty, these prediction errors over time, we can build a model that is adaptive and allows us to function in the world. But how do we stitch together a coherent world model, right? So we have a really difficult problem in the sense that the various sensory streams of information, auditory, visual, tactile, interoceptive, and so on, are all coming in at different times in different ways. And not only that, we also have this rich repertoire of conceptual capacities that we have to stitch this together into kind of a bounded, coherent world model. And this is extraordinarily tricky and a kind of central problem in neuroscience. And so this is from the first figure in our paper, and this is partially really the standard active inference story, which is that you have various streams of input, including all of the different sensory modalities that I mentioned. And through initially unimodal processing areas of the brain, where these sensory streams are segregated, there's this gradual buildup through abstraction, compression, and binding in more transmodal and multimodal regions of the brain, integrative hubs, so to speak. We get increasingly a kind of unified world model. So taking the kind of separate streams that are gradually combined in the brain in different regions, and then you're able to kind of build this coherent view of reality. And to kind of bring that intuition home, we use this term Bayesian binding. And so, what is approximately going on is that you have a prior. So we're just using an example of the face in this case. So you imagine that you have a high-level abstract representation of a face, a belief that you've learned over your history. And then you have this noisy sensory input, say a face in the dark or so, or you see a face just out of the corner of your eye. But by combining these two bits of information, your beliefs and the data through the standard kind of approximate Bayesian scheme, you end up at a posterior that actually looks clean and makes sense, because when you combine your previous learning with the noisy data, you can make sense of the world. And this is your bound face percept, which is normally, this mixture of sensory experiences, but then gets bound by the help of your abstract priors. And the idea is that this is what we do for our whole world model. So we bind together all this information in the same way that we bind a face. So hierarchical multimodal Bayesian binding permits this unified coherent reality model. And so what I mean by reality model is this whole experience of reality that we have. So we can all kind of tune in to see, okay, I'm aware of the fact that I have a body. I'm aware of the fact that I have a stream of thoughts and all of these different sensory experiences unfolding. And so we don't only have a reality model, crucially, we are aware of it, right? So we can say that active inference satisfies criteria 1, that gives you a good way of thinking about how a world model could be built. And criteria 2 is inferential competition. So obviously some things are conscious and not others, and there's the deep question of why are some things conscious and other things remain below the threshold of awareness. So for example, we're aware of the three-dimensional experience of this illusion, which is just a hollow mask, but we're not aware of what allows us to perceive it as three-dimensional, nor are we aware of the processes that lead to the fact that the hollow mask actually flips and gives us the illusion of a sticking out mask because of our previous experiences with faces and light and so on. So a lot of processing remains below the threshold of consciousness. And same goes, for example, the classic case of binocular rivalry. So if you present one stimuli to the left eye, another stimuli to the right eye, we're only conscious of either one of those at a time or some sort of mixed percept of them, because the brain infers that you shouldn't have the same stimulus in the same spatiotemporal location. So you get this flipping back and forth. but we're not aware of how that happens, right? So inferential competition, there's nothing particularly new about it. It draws on 150 years of selectionist thinking in cognitive science, and GPT-3 frames the history like this, going back to William James and kind of applying evolutionary ideas to the kind of competition between various mental states and their, trying to reach the threshold of consciousness. And you have various kind of iterations of this over the years, competitive neural networks and biased competition, models of attention. So attention has often been, playing this role of selection or gating. And this is, of course, in the context of consciousness, well worked out in global neuronal workspace theory in terms of local representations racing for ignition, where the winner is broadcast into this global workspace, or as Dennett puts it, this is the sort of fame in the brain idea. So the important representations win the competition for ignition. And then this gets formalized, of course, in predictive processing and active inference as precision. So probably everyone here is familiar with the idea of precision, but this is the kind of formal selection, what allows for a formal selection process within active inference. So you have your prior expectations that are have a distribution, and then a kind of confidence distribution, and then the incoming evidence from the world as well. And then it's through combining these you get your inferred estimate. And depending on the weighting of your priors and incoming evidence, your inference, your posterior, can look quite different. So for instance, if you have exaggerated beliefs about evidence precision, that is, you're just paying attention to the evidence out there, but not your priors, then you might miss a camel that is actually there if your priors were working, but you won't see it because you're only so heavily weighting the input in this case. And on the other hand, if you have exaggerated beliefs about your priors, then you'll hallucinate. Even when there's not a camel there, you will actually potentially hallucinate a camel. And so this precision-weighted melee allows you to instantiate inferential competition. So we can also say that in active inference, we have a mechanism for this competitive process that allows for the selection of particular posteriors that end up making it into the reality model that we experience. Okay, so now we're up to criteria 3, and this is where it's the more novel stuff, potentially. And so the question remains, why does the reality model know that it exists? It's not just that we're generating the reality model. Somehow we're aware of the fact that we have this model of the world. So all of our visual phenomena, sounds, our narratives about ourselves and thoughts and emotions, smells and actions and so on, all of this, we can either be aware of it or not, right? We can somehow reflect on our world model. And, often attention plays this role, but actually we can also realize that we can be aware of our attention. So I think you need something more global and ultimately more recursive to allow you to know the whole world model, including changes in our attentional states. So what we mean by the term epistemic depth is a capacity or continuum so deepening of knowing or awareness that can be more or less active, or intense or clear. So mindfulness is a good example. So you can be very unmindful. Let's say you're driving a car and you're off in your thoughts, or you're listening to a podcast or something. You obviously still got a reality model that's allowing you to navigate the world, but you're not aware of the fact that you're driving basically at all, and you're not encoding it into memory. And so if you become aware of the fact that you're driving, suddenly there's epistemic depth, right? There's deep knowing of your world model. And this can be extremely dull, like in the case of as you're just about to fall asleep, or it can be exceptionally clear, as in the case of like meditative states or mindfulness. So our solution for how epistemic depth might be achieved is to recursively share your world model with yourself. And this creates the beautiful loop. And so just to give you an intuition for this, which we'll go into more detail, When we speak out loud, we produce sounds, and at the same time, we hear those sounds and their meaning. So we hear our own voice in what we are saying. Therefore, our output, our voice, is also our input sound. So these kinds of loops are everywhere, and they're kind of all over the hierarchical active inference system anyway. But what we're saying is that as we generate this global unified reality model, there's also a loop there in the sense that our model of reality becomes an input to ourselves. We discover ourselves as a world, and then that world is what we can explore and interrogate and update and so on. And this is really, I think, unique of um, biological minds at this moment. I don't see any kind of instantiation of this in AI at the moment. This capacity to generate a coherent world model, then reflect on the world model in a kind of global way. And so now we can put these three things together. So first you have I mean, it's all happening in the hierarchy. So we have this it's all happening there together, but we're going to separate it out just for the sake of illustrating the kind of conceptual point where you have this complex hierarchy of processing that allows you to have this create an understanding of the causes of your sensory data. There's an inferential competition unfolding within this hierarchy where only certain winning inferences bind into the global posterior, the world model, and there's this pressure for coherence into the world model. And so through this inferential competition, we get this coherent, bound together model of reality. That's kind of a dance between our priors and the input to create this coherent posterior that we then navigate. And then, as with everything in the system, it's shared with the system itself. So this is epistemic depth. The world model is reflected into the abstraction hierarchy. The broadcast information enhances the binding process by upweighting representations that cohere with the unified world model. So this world model now also provides the constraints for future iterations of inference, because you of course want all future iterations to cohere with your current world model. This is what allows like ongoing stability of our experience to persist over time. And again, to kind of bring this intuition home, it can be helpful to think of epistemic depth as parallel to precision and abstraction. So we have precision here on the y-axis, abstraction on the x-axis, so the degree of abstraction and the amount of precision, you can imagine that there's like a certain amount of precision and abstraction is required to be even potentially aware. And then we have this space of things that are in our reality model that can be known, including background sensations and focused object and mind-wandering states and so on, so all the potential states. But it's epistemic depth that allows the actual awareness of these states. So for example, if you take thoughts, when thoughts are mindful, we're aware of them. But and we can be aware again of our transitions in our attentional state. But if we have focused thoughts, we might not even know that we're thinking them, right? We might be having them, but we might not be aware of them. And certainly we're not aware of, for example, background sensations unless we bring attention and epistemic depth, we think, to them. So the shirt on your back, for instance. Okay, so how to model epistemic depth using active inference? I think, this is an open problem. And, at the base level, this is a kind of conceptual idea with a computational backbone in the sense that we're trying to think through it computationally. But we can try now to think about how to model this. And it can look very different in brains and in different AI systems. And I'll kind of give a kind of broad sense of what that might look like. So we propose this idea of hypermodeling, again, with the help of Karl very much here. And so hypermodels are basically, what we propose is that active inference requires a truly higher order hypermodel that tracks how each layer's precision weightings are being deployed system-wide. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time unpacking that now. But basically, hypermodeling forecasts precision deployment across the whole hierarchical stack, essentially enacting global preferences for precision. So the hypermodel actually, in a way, in the same way that you're trying to understand the causes of your senses, you take your precision field, the precision kind of stack, the whole hierarchical stack, as the hidden state that you're trying to understand. So the hypermodel actually starts to model the precision weighting across the hierarchical stack. And so now you get a model of models. So because the loop spans the whole hierarchy, the model ends up not only representing what the world probably is, but also how well it knows what the world probably is. This world model reflecting quality is epistemic depth. And this loop between the hypermodel and the first order stack of processing uh, is the beautiful loop, right, that we presented earlier. And so in terms of like what this adds to the standard model, so you have your multi-layer generative process as you normally do. And then what we do is add a global hypermodel to this. So this defines a generative process including hyperparameters, which modulate precision across the layers. And this is what enables the system-wide meta inference, supporting epistemic depth. And then we also can reduce hyper-free energy. And so this measures global prediction error incorporating all states and hyperparameters. So both what the hypermodel is trying to do and the first order stack, and minimizing this tunes the entire hierarchy, enabling recursive sharing of the reality model central to epistemic depth. And so this allows this kind of recursive refinement of a global reality model. And just like one more intuition building figure here is kind of a smart glass process where, excuse me, where the first order stack of processing, which is building the world model, is under normal circumstances transparent, right? In the sense that like a glass that you're looking through, you don't see the glass, you don't see your models. The models are being built. It's like what's allowing you to drive without being aware that you're driving, or ride a bicycle if you don't drive. But this transparency is when you're basically adaptively unconscious, you could say. And what we're saying is this hypermodel, by modeling the precisions across the hierarchy, allows you to know what you know. And so this allows you to transition the transparency of the stack into an opaque stack that is now seen, like seeing the window that you were before just looking through. And most of the time, most of our inferences, we just look through. It's what allows us to, deal with this like complex stream of information. And it's only small, tiny bits, of course, that we're actually aware of. And hypermodeling may be the way that this stack becomes aware, so to speak. And so it's a bit like if you imagine the hierarchy is building a model of the world. In a way, the hypermodel plays the role of like a conductor that's kind of tuning and it kind of brings this unity to the overall picture, to the overall orchestra, to create a kind of coherent symphony in a circular feedback kind of way. So the loop is between the conductor and the whole orchestra. So the hyperparameter is the conductor's master dial that tells every instrument how confident it should be in the notes it is playing. It hands out these confidence levels to every layer in the hierarchy based on global context. Awareness emerges when the hypermodel conducts the whole predictive orchestra, recursively tuning precisions until every part both shapes and is shaped by the music of the whole. So I think with the idea that potentially with something like hypermodeling and epistemic depth, active inference can also satisfy criteria 3, and therefore potentially provide a theory of consciousness, at least to the same extent as existing theories of consciousness, let's say. And they all have troubles because consciousness is a slippery, very slippery thing. So how might something like a hypermodel or epistemic depth be instantiated in the brain? I think this is really tricky. In fact, we tried to avoid this altogether, but reviewers forced us to come up with something. And so I'm really open to many ideas about what might be, how this might be instantiated in the brain. But obviously, one thing that the brain already does, as I said, has this unimodal processing hubs, and then the long range connections that allow for higher order processing, but also just the integrative processing. So, okay, there's already some things in the brain that allow for this kind of global processing of information, which we can draw on. But we also want to propose something else. So how can something like a global precision field be modulated? Or another way of putting this in terms of what we're trying to do here, what could enact global recursive control of the whole stack? I think including the kind of unimodal processing features, right? And so for that, we propose a dual channel broadcast for the hyperparameter or the precision field. And the first channel is neuromodulatory sprays, and the other is phaptic electric fields. So I'll present those. Can I just get a quick time check? I can't actually see the time on my computer.
Sure. You are, you have about 15 more minutes.
Oh, perfect.
And you can extend that to 25 if you want to go over the 40 minutes.
All right. I went right. Yes, good. Thank you. So neuromodulation has a rich history. It's not an area that I'm an expert on, but there's a few things about it that makes me think that it's a potential channel for this kind of broadcast. And what we mean by sprays is this sense of like, again, it's this sense that it's spraying throughout the whole brain and tuning it. So sprays are brief diffuse bursts of noradrenaline, acetylcholine, serotonin, and dopamine that can shift synaptic gain over hundreds of milliseconds, embedding slow contextual information such as arousal, valence, and uncertainty. These are arguments many people are making, and there's, I think, a lot of evidence for this basic picture. Neuromodulation is the brain's way, you could say, of changing its own weighting rules. Rather than transmitting specific content, neuromodulators set the general tone, alter the rules of excitability, and enable flexibility and context dependence in neural computation. In fact, neuromodulation can also kind of modulate the way the networks themselves are kind of organized. So it's both changing the gain and the organization of the network. So there's really global processes it can shift over not very fast, but reasonably fast time spans. Or in Karl Friston's words, all three neuromodulator systems play the same computational role, namely an encoding of precision. Furthermore, all three neurotransmitter systems have the same basic effects on synaptic transmission, namely a neuromodulatory gain control. So, for something to control globally precision, this seems like we might be on the right track here. And so the second channel that we think is important is phaptic electric fields. Phaptic comes from the Greek word to touch, and so it's the electric fields generated by synapses, and so they're like touching throughout the brain, right? And so you're getting these relationships between all of these little electric fields produced by neurons throughout the brain, and this leads to all kinds of interesting emergence of all sorts of interesting patterns of electrical activity, and so. There's much work on this happened in the last decade or so around checking whether these electric fields are just emergent phenomena or are they, in fact, do they have downward causality? And it turns out that they do have causal effects on the brain. So when many neurons fire together, they generate a local field potential. The resulting extracellular electric field can push neighboring neurons a little closer to or further from their firing threshold. This phaptic coupling helps synchronize assemblies of neurons. And this is, of course, what we measure when we're doing things like EEG, right? And MEG for magnetic fields. These experiments, so this is now referring to the paper here by Froelich and McCormick, show that the weak electric fields generated during normal neocortical activity have the potent potential to form a feedback loop that modulates the very activity that generates them. So you get this loop where they generate the electric fields, but these electric fields also affect the firing of the neurons themselves. And so, and this is the crucial bit, macroscopic electric activity may thus represent a dynamic feedback mechanism that could serve as a network-wide synchronization signal that enhances the spatiotemporal structure of network activity. This is cool, and this is what then starts to look something like the kind of top-down causal influence that something like a unified reality model could have on the rest of the system in this sort of recursive, loopy way. So when you put this together, so working in tandem, the sprays may set the baseline temperature of belief, so broad stroke changes in gain or confidence over longer periods of time, while the fields impose rapid fine-grained tuning, so dimming the gain on a specific granular feature. So for example, dimming the gain on a specific, together broadcasting an updated field to every layer in time for the next perception action step. So the best we can, I think, come up with at this point is this dual channel broadcast, both neuromodulatory sprays and electric fields for something like hypermodeling. And this again may allow this beautiful loop to play out. So we've got some idea now of how we might be able to build a self-aware world, but just for the fun of it, I suppose, let's consider how this might look in large language models, since this is all the kind of excitement is here at the moment. So epistemic depth allows us to not only know our world model, but to know the gaps, and to agentically and perhaps consciously seek a better world model in the future. It allows us to, you could say, know what we don't know. And this allows us to actually pursue out of curiosity to fulfill those gaps, not in some sort of like impulsive way, but in like a very aware way, in the way that I can explain to you where this gap in my knowledge is, and then to pursue the fulfillment of that gap. Hypermodeling allows the system to objectify or pacify and introspect about their own knowledge. And again, hypermodeling is just one way to instantiate this, I think, and may not be the end goal here, or may not be the final version of this. Epistemic depth therefore looks a lot like self-supervision, right? And this is a central issue in AI right now, is that AIs need to be reinforced by humans, and they don't have this capacity to basically just find their own way to better knowledge. They need to be supervised. Whereas humans, we have this extraordinary capacity to self-supervise, um, and I think part of that could be this idea of epistemic depth. And so this is a paper from mainstream large language model research that just came out about 2025 in 2025, so really a couple of months ago, that I think is like somewhat in the direction of what we're getting at with epistemic depth. So in this paper, Learning to Reason Without External Rewards, instead of depending on external evaluation, this system uses the model's own assessment of its outputs or reasoning process as feedback. And specifically, this intuitor model is trained on its own self-certainty, its own confidence. So basically what it does is that it makes an output. So the model produces some output, then it checks its own confidence about that output and then rewards when it gets more confident. And so then you can kind of do gradient descent on confidence essentially, right? Like, so it outputs stuff, it checks its confidence on it, and then it just goes in the direction of more confidence. And this turns out to work really well. So it assesses its own output based on confidence, and then maximizes confidence. This allows it to improve on math and to perform really well compared to other kind of common models that are based on standard kind of reinforcement learning schemes. And with decent generalization to coding as well. So it's I think like this is a promising way to think about the same sort of thing we're talking about, right? Of monitoring your own precision as a way to know what you know and to self-supervise. But there's a difference, of course, with what we're saying in terms of hypermodeling. And the difference is this: current instantiations of confidence monitoring are external rather than internal. The model completes a sequence, computes a confidence score, and uses that number outside the conversation to adjust its weights during training. But the hypermodel is all internal, right? So to extend these prototypes into a true hypermodel, the precision confidence predictor must move inside the recurrent loop, issuing a forecast of the confidence profile before the next token or action is sampled, guiding decision making on the fly. So to do hypermodeling, you would need to, we're checking our own world model internally. We don't need to output something to know our world model and what we know and to our confidence. We know our own confidence on the fly. And so this is the kind of loop, the sort of extension that would be needed to do epistemic depth in the way humans do it. And I think this is cool and promising. This would put the loop inside even a kind of LLM system. And my background is in cognitive neuroscience, so I don't have the expertise to build something like this. But if you do, either please go ahead or let me know, and I'd love to come along on the journey for that. And meditation and altered states is a big interest for us. And you need to pay attention to this, I think, in any theory of consciousness, because this is the spectrum. This is the spectrum of consciousness, and if you're not explaining the spectrum, you don't really have a theory of consciousness. And so if you're interested in this part of it, and we can come back to this figure also in question time if you'd like. We go into how this theory helps us understand various different states of meditation in terms of abstraction, precision, and epistemic depth. And we also connect it to all the other theories. This could take forever to do in a talk, but there's, of course, many similarities to global neuronal workspace, a little bit like the reality model. Integrated information theory has this component of again, how it all comes together coherently. And recurrent processing theory, there's in hypermodeling a little bit of this kind of re-representation, also as in higher order thought theory. So there's, of course, there's much overlap. And I think one of the promising things, of course, is that active inference gives us this formal way of working with it. So consciousness remains a pretty big problem, but hopefully this gets us it just gives us another way to think about it. This sense of being able to rediscover our own reality model. In this sort of recursive way, and at least trying to model something like this, I think, is valuable. And really, I think what's new is this idea of, okay, yes, there's building the reality model, but obviously we have this capacity to be aware of it, and I think this is really something important to figure out. So let's just review the basic thesis, and then we'll finish. A system that is conscious satisfies three criteria: a world model, inferential competition, and epistemic depth. Together they form a beautiful world, a loop, a world model that knows itself. This beautiful loop enables the epistemic agency, global flexibility, and self-awareness reminiscent of self-supervised general intelligence. Active inference with hypermodeling could satisfy the criteria for a theory of consciousness, and curious to hear if you agree or alternatives. Thanks for listening.